Welcome to the Scientific Enneagram podcast, where we dive into the intersection between the Enneagram and the sciences. My name is Danielle, and I am your host. Today, I'd like to go over some of the basics of Dr. Dan Siegel's relatively new book, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy. If you are not familiar, this is pretty much the first science-based book that's come out on the Enneagram. And I put an asterisk next to the Enneagram because it technically is a different framework. It uses the Enneagram as a foundation, but it creates new language, new terms, new relationships, new definitions to give therapists, clinicians, psychologists a new model that can help them when they're dealing with clients in therapy situations. So today I am going to go over some of the basics. It's a 400-page book, so I'm not going to get into all the nuance. I'm just going to focus on the key aspects and definitions that they cover in the book, and maybe in later episodes I can dive into some of them in a little bit more detail. So this book proposes a framework that they call Patterns of Developmental Pathways, or PDP. Broken down, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's you develop personality patterns throughout your life, and then you repeat those over and over. And you are creating neural grooves in the process. The more you do something, the more you're prone to do it in the future. The quote that they repeat over and over in the book is, "Where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows." Essentially boils down to, we're going to take the path of least resistance, and we tend to follow that over and over again the more we do it. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those are developmental pathways. When it comes to the Enneagram, we talk about patterns. There's 9 types that follow different patterns. Obviously, there's flexibility amongst those, but that's where the first P in PDP comes from, is patterns of developmental pathways. So within the PDP framework, they really had 3 key ideas they were trying to focus on. The first is to create a clinically useful, neurobiologically informed framework of personality. There's lots of frameworks of personality out there, but what has been lacking is something that's rooted in neuroscience and neurobiology. By creating a framework like that, it allows researchers and clinicians to test the theories, test the hypotheses, build off of it, and help clients in a more scientifically backed way. The second key idea of the PDP framework is to develop a lifespan model of personality to link infant and child temperament to adult personality. There's been a lot of research done on adult personality. There's been even more research done on child development, but there's not a lot that's been done linking the two, and how does our upbringing affect our personality. Dan and the PDP group are using this framework as an attempt to do just that. The third key idea of the framework is that our desire to seek what he calls wholeness is the primary driver for us to develop our personality throughout life. Wholeness might sound a little woohoo, but that is the phrase and the terminology that he uses throughout the book, essentially saying that we're always trying to become a whole version of ourselves, a balanced version of ourselves, being able to do and be whoever it is that we at our core want to be, even if we're not fully aware of that. And seeking that is when we start to dive into our personality, what's holding us back, etc. So those are the 3 key ideas within the PDP framework. Another thing that the framework addresses explicitly is the difference between nature and nurture. It's a age-old debate on what makes us who we are. The answer is both. The book addresses that. It does do some work to help define the difference between those. How the PDP framework defines the nature portion is essentially your temperament. It is what you're born with. It's what's in your DNA. They also, though, group any experiences that you have in utero or in infancy, like right after birth. Obviously, those are going to have an impact on you, but it's so early on that he treats all of that as more or less nature. It's not something that you're learning, you're not adapting. It just is who you are. That is your temperament. The nurture portion of the argument, he also factors in and refers to those as adaptive strategies. Hopefully that makes sense on its surface. You experience life with your temperament, and then you see what ways that does and does not work for you. So you start developing some strategies to adapt to your surroundings, to adapt to the people that you know. Those make up the nurture part of the equation. What he proposes is that your temperament, or the nature, plus your adaptive strategies, your nurture, together equal your personality, or again, what he calls developmental pathways. Okay, so now that we've talked about temperament and adaptive strategies, it begs the question, what is the point of all of this? What are they even trying to get at? If you're listening to this and you're a fan of the Enneagram, you probably already know. The whole point is that we're not static beings. We are not born one way and destined to live without change for the rest of our lives. We have neuroplastic brains, which means that we can change, we can adapt. I mentioned those neural grooves earlier. As our brains form, literal electrical signals are sent from your brain to your body and back. And when they keep running the same course, if you keep doing the same thing, they're going to take that path of least resistance. It takes effort and intention in order to get that path to change. So you can behave differently, you can act differently, you can literally rewire your brain so energy flows differently, and that's all thanks to the neuroplasticity we have. On the other hand, Dan and the PDP group argue that your salience, or what's important to you, is part of your temperament, and that is ingrained deeply. Considering that your temperament plus those adaptive strategies yield your personality, it does beg the question, if part of it can't change, but part of it can, does that mean that your personality can fundamentally change? In Enneagram theory, your type doesn't change. You are a specific type. You can learn to adapt. You can grow your wings. You react differently in stress and security, but your type is your type life through. This book, it doesn't challenge it directly. It doesn't say we disagree with that. It does bring it up as something that needs to be studied more deeply. It will not go as far as say, yes, your type or your pattern is one thing forever. Instead, it acknowledges that that's the theory behind the Enneagram, and then says that the PDP theory cannot fully support that without more evidence and without more study. I had a debate recently with Jeff Cook from Around the Circle about this language of types and patterns. And he is a Enneagram enthusiast through and through. He's a philosopher. He is a super smart dude and knows this stuff, and isn't a fan of the fact that Dan and his group get away from calling these types. Personally, I love it. I love that they are called patterns and not types. I love the idea that you might not just be one type, that at any given moment you are exhibiting a pattern. That to me is a lot more digestible. It's a lot less intimidating. Trying to figure out your type is such an ordeal, and I know it took me months to figure out mine, all of my friends. Some people I know it's taken years and they still aren't sure. And the tool becomes unusable if you don't know your type. You can't use the integration of all 9 Enneagram types and the shifting and how you react to things as a growth tool until you nail down your type. In the PDP framework, by calling them patterns, you could identify with a specific pattern and say, I resonate with this right now, or I resonate with this when I'm under these situations, and then use that framework as a way to modify or mitigate some of the downstream effects of following that pattern to better suit you. So personally, I'm a fan of using patterns over types, but everybody's going to have their own opinion on that. All right, so speaking of using alternate language, there are 3 key concepts that the book covers that I won't go into a lot of detail on, but I do want to cover because they are foundational to the PDP framework. And those are vectors or systems of mind. I'm going to say vectors from here on out. Attendency and modes of emotional regulation. So let's start with vectors first. As Dan writes in the book, these are interconnected systems that operate as fast-thinking processes that channel the flow of attention and emotion-driven motivational energy along different pathways towards satisfaction of certain fundamental needs. In Enneagram world, we're all familiar with centers of intelligence, or your head, your heart, and your gut. That is essentially what vectors are, but I want to be clear with the language because head, heart, and gut can kind of feel a little squishy. What do you mean your gut? What does that actually physically mean when you're talking about that with somebody new to the Enneagram? Are they going to be able to catch on to that or not? So the vectors that the PDP group identifies are agency, bonding, and certainty, or ABC. So easy to remember. And these are essentially what you're most motivated to regulate and stabilize. Agency is essentially your need to influence your immediate reality. When you're born, you all of a sudden you come out of the womb, you have to breathe, you have to swallow, you have to nurse, or else you won't survive. So that is a key fundamental process or system of mind. As I mentioned, they're called. There's a part of your mind that says you have to be able to do things. You have to be able to take control of your immediate surroundings and do what needs to be done to survive. A second vector or system of mind is the bonding vector. This is analogous to the heart in Enneagram, but you're motivated to regulate and stabilize your relationships. You're driven to keep relational attunement, to stay close to those that are close to you, and that will help you survive. Again, when you're a baby and you come out, you have to rely on other people. You have to have caregivers, or you can't make it in this world because you're just a dumb, squishy little baby. So there's a system of mind that says you need people to care for you and take care of you. Make sure to foster those bonds and put attention towards that. That's the bonding vector. So we have agency, bonding, and then the third one is certainty. Certainty is analogous in Enneagram speak to the head triad. It's less life or death, but it's still a major driver for us humans, is the need to be able to understand and predict the future or our surroundings. We need to be able to have a feel of what's going on around us so that we're not overwhelmed by the chaos. So agency, bonding, certainty are the 3 vectors, and those are all related to what you're most motivated to regulate and stabilize. Dan and the PDP group put this under the umbrella of temperament. This is something you are born with. We're all going to prioritize all 3 of those to some extent. We're all going to probably shift our priority at different phases of life or under different circumstances. But the argument within the framework is that one of those is likely to have more salience than the other 2 on a day-to-day basis. And that's just something that your brain was naturally wired to prioritize. So along with these vectors come emotions. When you are motivated to have agency to do things, when you don't have that, when you are helpless to do what you think you need to be doing, that fosters anger. So anger or rage are often associated with agency. For bonding, When you don't have the bonds that you think that you need to be having, that generates sadness. So bonding and sadness, or panic, as it's sometimes mentioned, are grouped together. And then the emotional reaction to not having certainty is fear. These three emotions align extremely well with Panksepp's framework of emotion systems. This is a psychological theory that I won't go into a lot of detail on this episode, but he has 7 blue ribbon emotion systems, 3 of which are bad emotions and 4 of which are good, positive emotions. And those 3 negative emotions directly correlate with agency, bonding, and certainty. All right, so have you committed those to memory? Agency, bonding, certainty. Those are the 3 vectors, the 3 systems of mind. We all have those 3 areas that are competing for time and energy and attention, and all of us tend to gravitate towards one more than the other. The other part of temperament that the PDP includes is something called attendency. You probably heard me mention this earlier and thought, I have never heard of that word before. That's because Dan Siegel made it up. But attendency is where your attention tends to direct. I won't go into critiques of the book too much. This is one area that was fairly loosely defined at this point, and hopefully in future iterations or future books or future studies, it gets cleared up a bit more. They use the term energy to refer to literal electrochemical energy of neural firing, which transmits information forward from the body's many internal and external sensory systems, and also outward into the mobilization of the body into behavior. That's a mouthful, and it kind of is up to the reader to interpret what that means, because it's not really directly pared down and defined. So my interpretation is that your tendency is essentially your primary reference point for making sense of the world. The 3 tendencies that you can have are essentially directional. Do you have an outward tendency, an inward tendency, or do both kind of happen at the same time and compete for resources? Another way to put it, a shorter way to put it, is that outward tendency is that you reference the external world around you. Inward tendency, you're referencing your own internal world, your internal structures. And then what they call dyadic tendency is going both ways, and you're referencing the interaction between your internal and external worlds more so than you are one or the other. There actually isn't a mapping of a tendency to Enneagram. There are close overlaps, like dyadic, the both ways. Those are going to be your 3s, your 6s, and your 9s. That maps pretty cleanly onto the attachment triad within the connection centers. However, outward, as defined by the PDP, are your 2s, your 7s, and your 8s, while your inward tendencies are your 1s, 4s, and 5s. If you look up Enneagram theory, nowhere will you find 1, 4, and 5 grouped together, while 2, 7, and 8 are grouped together. So this is an interesting take, and again, something slightly different than Enneagram theory. But Dan and the PDP group argue that this is your ingrained monitoring system. It's what you use and what you reference to make sense of what is going on along your vectors, along those agency, bonding, and certainty vectors. So you have your vectors, you have a tendency, and together those make your temperament. Notice you had 3 vectors, ABC, and you had 3 tendencies, inward, outward, dyadic, or IOD. When you multiply those together, you get 9 types. You get 9 patterns of behaving, or 9 different variations on temperament. So you might be thinking, Danielle, you just told us that personality is a combination of temperament and adaptive strategies. So how is the PDP a personality framework when you're saying that the 9 types fall solely under temperament? How I have interpreted the book is that your temperament is how you are going to naturally react to the world without any external influences whatsoever. Obviously, that's never going to happen. We're all going to have plenty of external influences, but your temperament is your core. You learn and adapt and grow on top of that, and you change things about yourself, but your inherent personality is equal to your temperament as a baseline. Your temperament is what creates those neural grooves. Your temperament is what, again, whether it's genetic or very, very early experiences, creates your brain structure the way that it starts out. And as they said in the book multiple times over, where attention goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. The more neural firing there is in a specific direction, the stronger those neural connections are going to be, and the more that will function on autopilot moving forward. In a lot of situations, this is extremely helpful from an evolutionary perspective. We don't have the time, the resources, the energy to be making every single decision, every single day, every single moment at a nuanced, critical thinking level. A lot of what we do has to be on autopilot, or else we would be completely overrun by sensations and thought and paralyzed with indecision. Running on autopilot is helpful a lot of the time. It is not helpful all of the time. And that's why we do therapy. And that's why we do personality work and Enneagram work and PDP work, is to try to understand what those patterns are, identify them, identify what parts of those patterns are helping us versus hurting us, and then figure out how we can expand our repertoire of strategies for handling day-to-day issues so that we can adapt if and when necessary. So now that we've talked about the temperament side of the personality equation, let's talk about the other side, or the nurture side. The framework that the PDP discusses is that of modes of emotional regulation. The 3 different types of emotional regulation strategies that they discuss are those of upregulation, downregulation, and shifting. So upregulation is essentially taking those bad emotions that you're feeling inside and experiencing them or expressing them. Downregulation is when you contain those inside or channel them into something else. And then shifting is completely redirecting or reframing. If this sounds familiar, it's because it maps perfectly onto the Enneagram concept of outlook triads. Competency being the same as downregulation. Don't let your emotions control you, control them. Positivity triad being the shifting triad of let's just pretend these bad emotions don't exist and move on to something different. And then the reactivity triad being the same as upregulation, or let those emotions out, express them or experience them fully instead of pushing them away. No one of these 3 is always going to be the right answer. They can all come in handy at different times. They're just 3 ways of handling hard emotions. Knowing when and where is the right time to use each of these strategies is a tricky thing to do. And so we tend to gravitate towards one more than the others. In the PDP framework, it's proposed that that is part of your learned adaptive strategies rather than your ingrained temperament. So those are the 3 key concepts that the PDP framework, as it stands now, addresses. Vectors of agency, bonding, and certainty, which associate with anger, sadness, and fear in that order. You have attendency, which is essentially where your reference point is to make sense of the world. And those are inward, outward, and dyadic. And then the third concept is that of emotional regulation strategies, which are upregulate, downregulate, or shift. The last thing I'll cover on this episode is the nomenclature, since we're not using types in PDP world. So first of all, it is highly encouraged by Dan and his team that you are not called a specific pattern, that especially in a therapeutic setting, it is that you are exhibiting a certain pattern. That takes away from the stigma, from painting people in boxes, and it addresses what is in front of you so that you can adapt to that as opposed to labeling you and putting you in a corner. That said, since this is an Enneagram podcast, I will map those over to types just so that you can get a better understanding of how these all flesh out. So within the agency triad of 8s, 9s, and 1s, you'll have 8s being outward, 9s being dyadic, and 1s being inward. In the PDP, these are referenced as AO, AD, and AI. Within the bonding triad, you're going to have type 2s as referencing outward, type 3s as referencing dyadically, and type 4s as referencing inwardly. And those are BO, BD, and BI. And then finally, in the certainty triad, you have 5s referencing inward, 6s referencing dyadically, and 7s referencing outward, or CI, CD, and CO. I could talk about these mappings for another hour or more. It's very interesting, especially when you add in the emotional regulation strategies, how they are familiar to the Enneagram, yet still different in a very interesting way, and starting to see the patterns of what types have easy or difficult access to what other aspects, and how that differs between, your day-to-day wing influence versus your situational reactive stress and security influences. Maybe I can talk about that on a different podcast, but I do recommend checking out the book. I'll try to put something on Instagram as well so that you can see how these all map out. But for now, I think we'll call that a day. Thank you for joining me on this episode and diving into the PDP with me. It is super fascinating from both an Enneagram and a science perspective. And I know it probably won't be for everybody, but I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear if you read it, what your take was, if any of this helped clarify anything that the Enneagram had left previously fuzzy for you, or if you just disagree with any of the PDP framework. I'm not the author, so I won't take offense if you don't like something about it. You can contact me at hello@scientificenneagram.com or find me on Instagram at scientificenneagram. On that note, have a wonderful rest of your day and week, and don't forget to stay curious.